Today in the UK it is A-level results day, so I wanted to say a massive congratulations to anyone who's received their results, and I hope that you got the grades that you wanted and the grades that you deserve. 4 years ago I was accepted into Durham University to study modern languages and cultures, and I was so excited about this because Durham was always my dream university that I really wanted to go to, but at the same time I was terrified because there wasn't much information out there about the course and about the university. So I think when there's a lot of uncertainty, it makes things worse. I thought by making a video talking about my experiences today, I could help people who have just been accepted into the university or people who are thinking about applying in the future. I haven't been sponsored or paid by the university to make this video, so all of the opinions are my own, and I will be as honest as I possibly can be because I really think that honesty is what people need. You need to know what you're actually getting yourself into. So just to give a little bit of an introduction to who I am in case you've never watched my videos before. Hello, I'm Jack. I recently graduated from Durham University at the beginning of July this year with a first-class honours degree in modern languages and cultures with a year abroad. A very long degree title, but that's what it was. I did my year abroad and that's part of the degree title as well. Specifically, I studied French for the first 2 years and Spanish for the entire 4 years. I did my year abroad in the Canary Islands working as an English language assistant in a secondary school, so I'll be talking about that as well as the general university experience. So what I want to do in the first part of this video is to talk a little bit about what I did in years 1, 2, 3 and 4 to give a better overview of the course structure. So in your first year at Durham you can actually study up to 3 languages. You can do post A-level languages that you've learnt before in school, and you can also take up new languages ab initio, which means you're basically learning the language from scratch. This is a particularly popular option for a lot of students who really want to try and master 3 different languages. If you're doing post A-level languages, you will have 2 hours per language of traditional language learning classes per week. So these are basically the grammar and the speaking classes. But if you're doing a language from scratch and you're picking it up for the first time, you'll actually have around 4 to 5 hours of language learning per week, and it's classed as a double module. So most modules are 20 credit modules and they are single modules, but if you're learning a language from scratch, it will be a double module that counts for 40 credits, bearing in mind that the entire amount of credits that you have to do in the year is 120. I did French and Spanish both post A-level, so I knew the languages quite well before coming to university, and the language learning classes in the first year, to be honest, were just kind of a recap of a lot of the things we did at A-level. We revised a lot of grammar techniques like the subjunctive and the different tenses in French and Spanish. We did a little bit of translation work as well, just to try and get more confident in the language. The idea in the first year language classes is to bring everyone up to the same level. Obviously people have been to different schools and the teaching quality is different at different schools, so they just want to make sure that everyone is on board and that everyone understands the different areas of the language, like the key components of the languages. So you obviously practice your reading skills, your speaking skills, your writing skills and your listening skills. If you're studying a language from scratch, the language learning classes will obviously be slightly different. You'll start out with the basics and then throughout the year you'll work towards an A-level standard or equivalent. So you get to progress quite quickly throughout the year if you're learning a language from scratch. I obviously didn't do that, so I can't really comment on it from my own experience, but in terms of people that I know who did languages from scratch, they said it was quite intense and quite difficult. But if you are a real language learning genius, which you probably are if you got into Durham, then you will be able to do well if you persevere and put the effort in. It's definitely worth doing if there's a language you've always wanted to learn but you weren't able to take it up when you were in secondary school or sixth form. Alongside the language learning classes you do cultural modules, and these are basically modules about literature, film, history, artwork, politics, that kind of thing. So basically just learning about the cultures behind the languages that you're studying, which I think is really useful because I think to properly understand a language you have to understand the culture, particularly when you're interacting with native speakers. The first year culture modules are quite varied and quite broad in terms of what they deal with, and the idea in first year is that they introduce you to all different kinds of literature, all different kinds of film and all different kinds of cultural stuff, and then from that you decide which areas you want to specialise in later years. For example, in the first year literature modules, you study literature from the 11th century right up until the 21st century. So that's a massive amount of different time periods to study. Naturally, there'll be certain kinds of literature that you really enjoy studying, and there'll also be literature that you don't enjoy studying as much. But that's actually what first year is about. It's about learning what your academic interests are and learning what kind of things you want to pursue in the second and the final year when you get to do more specialised modules. So I'm going to go through the modules that I studied in my first year doing French and Spanish, just to give you a better idea of what the course content actually involves. So I did French Language 1, which is a compulsory module for any student who is doing French studies. It was 20 credits, actually all of these modules were 20 credits, working up to 120 credits in total. The French language module was just kind of a traditional language learning module, very organised, great in terms of improving speaking and revising all the important grammar rules that you studied at A-level. In terms of the cultural modules I did for French, the first one was called Reading French Literature, which was a bit hit and miss. Some of the literature I really enjoyed and some of it I didn't really enjoy that much, and that's kind of expected in first year because you will have to read stuff that you probably wouldn't want to read just to kind of figure out what you like and what you don't like. So just prepare yourselves a little bit in first year to have to kind of battle through and power through some of the books that you're required to read. I'm just reading off this piece of paper where I've listed all of the books that I studied as part of reading French literature. So we studied French poetry by Victor Hugo, Guigemar by Marie de France, which is like a kind of medieval French poem. Not really my kind of thing. I was not good at medieval French and I could never really understand it. For some reason the lecturers seemed to expect that we would be able to understand medieval French even though we had learnt modern French. And modern French is quite different to medieval French, particularly when you're reading it, like the spellings and everything, just so different. So I did not like medieval French. We also studied La Peste by Albert Camus, which was one of my favourite books that I studied in my entire degree. That one was really good. L'Ingénu by Voltaire and Britannicus by Racine. So quite a wide variety in terms of the kind of literature that we studied. We studied obviously plays, poetry, novels, short stories as well. The other module that I did as part of French studies was called The Invention of France. And back in 2015, this was the first year that they had run this module. So it was a little bit sort of messy, I think. I think they were still trying to figure out how to organise the module and what kind of content to include in it, and I believe the modules changed quite a lot over the years in terms of the module coordinator and in terms of the reading list. But just to give you a bit of an idea of what I studied specifically, I did Chanson de Roland, which is a kind of epic French poem, not really my kind of thing. Again, medieval French, you can probably see the pattern. I'm not really a fan of it. We did Lettres philosophiques by Voltaire, which is a kind of collection of essays based around different philosophical topics. Quite complicated, but also really intriguing. Mythologies by Roland Barthes, who is one of my least favourite writers actually. I'm not a fan of Roland Barthes, and you will definitely come across him in the languages degree. In fact, I even came across him in the Spanish degree as part of the secondary reading, so he appears everywhere, and he's probably quite an important figure. I just never really enjoyed reading his books. I found them a bit pretentious. And we also studied a little bit about colonial politics, which I thought was probably the most interesting part of the module, because colonialism and post-colonialism is such a massive part of cultural studies. The fact that I got to learn about this in my first year just really gave me the foundations that I needed to study colonial politics in my second and my final year. In terms of the Spanish modules that I studied, I did Spanish Language 1A, which is the compulsory language learning module, probably not as organised and as efficient as the French language module, but it was compulsory, so I had to do it anyway. I just had to power through. And then for the cultural modules, I did Introduction to Hispanic Literature and Culture, which was incredibly broad in terms of what we were actually studying. We got to study things from Latin America as well as Spain, which I really liked, because when I was doing A-level Spanish, we only really studied things about mainland Spain. So the fact that I got to branch out into Latin America was incredible. And actually Latin American literature and culture is one of my favourite academic interests. I absolutely love reading about it and writing essays about it. Things that we studied include Frida Kahlo's artwork. She's a Mexican painter, absolutely Amazing work. I loved writing on her. We got to study José Martí. We studied some poems by him. He's a Cuban poet. We studied Ficciones by Jorge Luis Borges. He is a short story writer. Not my favourite, very, very complicated and very kind of abstract ideas, but definitely worth pursuing if you're interested in that kind of thing. We studied Brevísima Relación de la Destrucción de las Indias by Bartolomé de las Casas, which is about the colonization of the Americas. Really like a foundational text that I'm so happy that I got to study, because it allowed me to understand so much about the beginnings of colonialism and then to see how it progressed over the years. We studied La Casa de Bernarda Alba by Federico Garcia Lorca, which is a play, and then we studied a collection of medieval ballads and epic poems. I also did a module called Conflict and Violence in the Spanish-Speaking World. This was probably my favourite module out of first year because it had a very specific theme. The other modules were kind of just introductions to different kinds of literatures, whereas this had a specific theme, conflict and violence. And yes, it was quite a violent module in terms of the required reading. Very gory, very bloody texts, but really like good texts. Like, they kept me on edge. I really enjoyed reading the books and actually studying the films, because we started the module by studying El Laberinto del Fauno by Guillermo del Toro. In English it's called Pan's Labyrinth. It's quite a famous film and definitely one of my favourites that deals with Spanish Civil War and Franco's Spain. We also studied El Alcalde de Zalamea by Pedro Calderón de la Barca, I think he's called, which is a play. Not really my favourite, but really interesting in terms of characterisation, so a kind of character study. We studied some saints' poems, so basically religious poems about different saints across Europe. We did ¿Quién puede matar a un niño?, which is Who Can Kill a Child, an incredibly violent and disturbing film. We studied El Orfanato, which is also an amazing film, and Carta de Jamaica by Simón Bolívar. First year for me was a little bit hit and miss, as you can probably gather, because you're introduced to so many different kinds of books. Naturally, you will like some of them and you will dislike some of them. You just have to kind of prepare yourself for that, because I will say first year in terms of academic interests, you're probably not going to be able to pursue everything that you want to study. You will be studying very generalised modules rather than specific modules that specialise in a particular topic or a particular author. As I've said, the idea is that you figure out what you like and what you don't like, and then you end up pursuing your interests in years 2 and 4. So moving into the second year, you can only take 2 languages in the second year. So if you did 3 languages in first year, you have to decide to drop one of them and just focus on 2. As I did French and Spanish in my first year, I just kept doing French and Spanish in my second year. But you can focus on one language a little bit more than the other. So for example, I did 4 Spanish modules and 2 French modules. So as long as you're doing 120 credits in the year as a whole, there's no real requirement in terms of how many credits you have to do per language. You'll have to do at least 20, but around that you can kind of figure out the modules you want to take and which ones you'll find most interesting. The reason why I took more Spanish modules in my second year was because I personally think the Spanish modules at Durham are a lot better than the French ones. I'm not sure if the quality of teaching is always on the same level, but I personally find the modules are a lot more interesting and a lot more innovative. The French modules at Durham are very traditional, to be honest. They are kind of what you expect to study from a French degree at any university in the UK. Whereas the Spanish modules are just completely different. I studied things that I never thought I would come across as part of a university degree. I felt like the lecturers were a lot more passionate and a lot more different, like they dared to be different, and I loved that. I actually think the most kind of obscure modules are the best. And obviously one of the great things about second year is that you can start to specialise in areas that you are really interested in. So you kind of think about what you liked in first year and then focus on what you liked and what you're good at. So in terms of modules that I studied, I did French language 2, obviously that's the compulsory module for anyone doing French studies. I did Introduction to Francophone Literature and Culture, which was a kind of colonial and post-colonial based module, which I absolutely loved the content of. I don't think it was a particularly well organised module in terms of the way it was coordinated, but in terms of the actual content, it was fascinating and taught me so much about French history that I had no idea about. Some of the texts that we studied as part of this were Une si longue lettre by Mariam Abbar. We studied a film called Zala. We studied Le Harem Colonial by Alula. some short stories by Albert Camus, Femme d'Alger dans leur appartement, L'Enfant de Sable, and Nouvelle d'Algérie. I just want to apologise if my French pronunciation isn't so great. As I've said, I dropped French at the end of my second year and I haven't spoke French since, so sorry for any terrible pronunciation. In terms of the Spanish modules, I did Spanish Language 2A, Race and Gender in Latin American Cinema, which was a really great module because I always kind of found cinema very interesting, but before coming to university I'd never really studied it on an academic level, and honestly film analysis is so difficult. Like, it is a real skill that you have to master. There are so many intricacies in terms of camera angles, in terms of movements on the screen, in terms of lighting and music. So much goes into films. This module gave me a much greater appreciation of visual culture, and obviously we live in such a visual world nowadays, so I think the fact that you can actually study cinema at university is really useful. And it also gave me a chance to learn a little bit more specifically about Latin America, focusing on the themes of race and gender, which are two themes that I've always been really interested in, so I always knew this was a module that I absolutely wanted to take. We studied so many films as part of the degree, so I'm just going to read a few of the ones out that I've written down. We studied La Teta Asustada, Amores Perros, El Niño Pez, Sleep Dealer, City of God, Contracorriente, Los Olvidados, Memorias del Subdesarrollo, Y tu mamá también, La Ciénaga, El Vuelco de Cangrejo, and Los Viajes del Viento. This module was a bit overwhelming in terms of the amount of films we studied, and then on top of the films we actually had to watch every single week. We also had to do required reading, and obviously you have to do required reading, but normally you just have like a primary text in the literature module and then you do a bit of research around that. For this, it was kind of double the amount of work because we had a film and then we had like an article to read. That was part of the primary work, and then we had to do extra secondary work in the library researching around the topic, because that's definitely something that Durham prioritises: research. Research is so important, particularly if you want to get a good mark in an essay, because you kind of have to go into the library, find journal articles, find books about the topic, and come up with different ideas and try and think outside the box to impress the lecturers. They're not looking for you to repeat what you've learned in the class, they're actually looking for you to come up with new ideas. Basically, the lecturers are just a kind of starting point where you kind of get inspiration and then you take that inspiration further in the direction that you're interested in. And when you're writing an essay, you definitely get rewarded if you come up with new and unique ideas. I also did a module called Icons and Myths in the Hispanic World, studying things like Simón Bolívar, Eva Perón, Che Guevara, and La Movida, which is a countercultural movement in Spain. This module was really designed around different figures and different movements rather than specific authors and specific texts. So this meant that we didn't actually have required reading as such. We were much more independent and there was a lot more kind of liberation to choose what you wanted to study. So for example, when we studied Eva Perón, we got to choose our own texts. I actually wrote an essay about the musical Evita, which was a really different essay to do, but honestly amazing because no one else really wrote on that. That was my choice to study that and to do it all kind of independently. Some people read novels about her, some people read short stories, some people looked at newspaper articles. There was a lot more freedom and a lot more choice to choose your own material to write essays about, and I think because of that it was just a lot easier to be original because obviously everyone was writing about something a little bit different. So a really great module if you're interested in independent research. Then the final module I did was Latin American texts. This was the module that I got the highest mark in out of all the modules I studied at university, so a really great module. We studied Monstruo by Junot Díaz, which is a short story, El Baúl de Miss Florence, which is Miss Florence's Trunk in English. It's basically a Jane Eyre retelling in the Caribbean, which I loved. Sirena Selena Vestida de Pena by Mayra Santos Febres, about a Dominican/Puerto Rican drag queen, and a film called Juan de los Muertos, so that was all in the first term. Then in the second term for that module we studied some short stories by Julio Cortázar, some poetry by Montejo, who is a Venezuelan poet, and Los de Abajo by Mariano Azuela, which is a novel about the Mexican Revolution. Second year was definitely a lot better in terms of module content because I got to focus on 20th and 21st century literature and culture, which is really what I enjoy and what I'm good at. So that was great, the fact that I got to study more specialised modules. As you move throughout the different years at university, you get a lot more choice of modules. So in the first year, for example, for French, there are only 5 modules to choose from. As you move into the second year, there might be around 8 or 9 modules to choose from. And as you move into final year, there might be 12 modules to choose from. And obviously, the more modules to choose from, that actually means the less people in each class. So you get a lot more one-to-one interaction with the lecturer, and they really get to know you a lot better when you move throughout the degree. Then moving into the third year. So the third year is the year abroad, and this is a compulsory part of the modern languages degree, and honestly, the best year of the degree. And I always find that a bit weird because I'm saying the best year at Durham University was the year when I wasn't in Durham. I was in the Canary Islands working as a British Council English language assistant in a secondary school, and honestly I absolutely loved the experience. It was amazing. The year abroad is quite a scary time initially because you honestly don't know what it's going to be like living abroad and setting up a life there. But I actually loved it once I settled in. I loved living in Gran Canaria. It's a beautiful island. There is so much there. I'm not going to talk forever about Gran Canaria in this video, but if you have an opportunity to do a year abroad in the Canary Islands, I would wholeheartedly recommend it. So obviously that's one of the options you can do for the year abroad. You can work as an English language assistant in a secondary school organised through the British Council. You can also work in a primary school, I believe, as well. So you get the choice of primary school or secondary school. And last year I did actually make a video talking about my experience as a British Council English language assistant. So if you want to watch that video, I'll link it down below in the description. I go into a lot more depth about the application process and the tips and tricks that I would give. You can also do an Erasmus exchange program where you go to study at a foreign university that Durham has links with. Basically what happens is that some Durham students go abroad and then some foreign students come to Durham, so you do kind of an exchange. That's really great if you want to study at a foreign university and learn a bit more. Obviously you'll get an amazing library with all different kinds of books in Spanish or in French, so a great opportunity for the really intellectual people out there. You can also do a work placement which you organise independently yourself, and Durham has quite a lot of links with different companies where you can do internships, particularly in big cities like Madrid, Barcelona and Paris. I know people who did marketing internships, people who did translation internships, people who worked with legal firms as well. So if there's a specific industry that you really are interested in, that's also an option, but it can be a little bit more difficult to organise because you don't have as much security and as much protection when you're not going through like the British Council scheme. So if you want to teach, British Council is really the way forward in terms of organisation and in terms of application process. Honestly, I would really recommend that. But if you really don't want to teach but you still want to work, definitely think about doing an independent work placement or an internship. Whilst you're on the year abroad, you also have to do something called a target language research project, which is either 2,500 words if you're studying 2 languages or 5,000 words if you're studying 1 language. And actually at the end of my second year I dropped French, so my entire year abroad was spent in the Canary Islands, obviously for Spanish. So I had to do a 5,000 word essay / project, kind of like a mini dissertation, which was written in Spanish. You can basically write about the location that you're in for your year abroad. So I think I wrote something about icons and myths of Gran Canaria, and I went to a lot of museums and looked at a lot of local exhibitions and I wrote about them. It's not the most difficult project in the world, particularly compared to the essays you normally write at university. The hardest thing about it is the fact that you have to write it entirely in the target language, and you've probably never written anything 5,000 words long in Spanish or in French before, so it's a little bit daunting at the start. But obviously when you're living in the country, there are so many resources out there that you don't have access to when you're in the UK. So it's a time to be creative, a time to think outside the box, and to produce work that's unique and different, because obviously everyone's going to different places for their year abroad, everyone's doing slightly different things, so the year abroad research project is really nothing to worry about. And now we're moving on to the final year, the 4th year, which is the last year of the degree. Honestly, the degree goes really fast, so 4 years sounds like a long time, but it is not. In the final year I only studied Spanish, but if you want you can still do 2 languages. You can keep up 2 languages throughout the degree. I just decided in the end to drop French at the end of my second year because I wasn't really enjoying French as much as Spanish. I wanted to spend an entire year abroad in Spain, and I wanted to specialise more in Spanish because I felt like I was better at it and I felt like I just preferred studying it. In the final year, the modules are a lot more specialised, so you really focus on specific areas based around the research expertise of the lecturers. Different lecturers research in different areas, so some of them might do 21st century Spanish culture, some of them might do 15th century French plays or something, so it tends to be very specific, and you get to obviously choose the modules that you're interested in. The emphasis in final year is definitely on independent research and critical thinking. They expect you to question absolutely everything that you read, so you must not take anything for granted. Please don't do that, because that's not what they're looking for. They're looking for you to challenge ideas and to think outside the box. That's really a massive thing that Durham promotes, thinking outside the box. So in terms of the modules that I studied in final year, obviously I did Spanish Language 4, which is 2 hours a week of Spanish practice with a native speaker. I did Spanish translation, which I really loved. It was such a practical module, and even though I've never been like amazing at translation, it's never been my strength, I really appreciated being able to do a module that was entirely dedicated to that specific skill. I learned a lot about literary translation in particular, and as part of the assessment I got to do a translation of the first chapter of a Spanish novel. So that was really different compared to like literature analysis and film analysis essays that I tend to do in the other modules. I also did a module called Contemporary Spanish Cinema, where we studied films such as Belle Époque, Amantes, Volver, Jamón Jamón, Los Lunes al Sol, Vacas, Te doy mis ojos, and Mar Adentro. These were really interesting films from the last 20 or 30 years, and the lecturer was really passionate about the topic, so it was kind of infectious. Like, I really did enjoy this module. Quite difficult at times because, as I've said before, film analysis is a skill that you really have to master, and it is not easy at all. It can be quite stressful at times because you feel like you don't really know what you're doing, you don't know if you're interpreting something correctly. And then the final module I did, which was a taught module, was Popular Culture in Latin American Literature. So for this we studied quite a lot of different things, including Julio Cortázar's short stories, particularly the ones that dealt with jazz music and classical music. We studied Los Pasos Perdidos by Alejo Carpentier. We studied 2 novels by Mario Vargas Llosa. One of them was Pantaleón y las Visitadoras, and the other one was La Tía Julia y el Escribidor. And then 2 novels by Manuel Puig, Boquitas Pintadas and El Beso de la Mujer Araña. This was a really challenging module because it was very theoretical. We had to study not only literature, but we also had to study kind of philosophical essays as part of the secondary reading. So very complicated topics and concepts to get my head around. At times my mind was just blown and it was a real mush in my brain, like quite difficult sometimes, but a really great module. I learned so much and it gave me so much more confidence in dealing with complicated topics and ideas. And then the final thing that I did in my final year was my extended 12,000 word dissertation in modern languages and cultures, and I have it here. Here is my dissertation. It was on revolutionary revisionism, magical realism, space and power in the historical fiction of Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And I got 78% on this, which is a first class honours mark. Honestly, I put so much effort into this, and I loved writing about Gabriel Garcia Marquez. He was a writer that I never really had the opportunity to study as part of the taught modules, so I knew that when it came around to the dissertation, he was a writer that I really wanted to write about. I'm really interested in magical realism, and throughout the degree I learned a lot about space and power in different contexts. So I kind of wanted to bring all those ideas together in the dissertation, because I think the thing with the dissertation is that you can kind of pick and choose areas that you're really interested in, and you can come up with your own research questions. You can really direct your own research. You're not given an essay title that you have to write. You actually come up with your own titles and your own chapters. So there's a lot more liberation and a lot more freedom to pursue things that you're genuinely interested in. You also have a supervisor to help you with the dissertation, to give advice. They tend to be an expert in the topic that you're writing about, so that's really useful. You're never alone. You always have the support you need. Obviously the dissertation is a lot more independent than other work and other modules, but actually it was the thing that I loved the most about university. Some people hate their dissertation. I actually loved mine, and I loved the topic when I chose it, and I loved the topic when I handed in the dissertation at the end. So Gabriel Garcia Marquez, thank you so much for writing amazing books that I loved writing about. So now I want to talk about the advantages of studying modern languages at Durham and the kind of things that might attract potential applicants. So the first thing is the fact that the course is incredibly varied and incredibly diverse. It's interdisciplinary and it's cross-curricular through and through. You get to study so many different kinds of modules, from language learning modules to literature modules, film modules, history, artwork, politics, all different kinds of things. And it's almost like doing loads of different degrees within the same degree. Cultural studies in particular covers so many different areas, and I just found that really enriching and really motivating. You're constantly studying something a bit different. All the lecturers have different interests and different expertise. The opportunity to study different themes in literature and to study different types of literature and different films. It was just a great experience. Before I came to Durham, I was kind of wondering if I should have done an English literature degree, because I actually got an A star in English literature at A level, whereas I got A's in French and Spanish, and I was so happy about languages, getting an A in French and Spanish at A level. That was not easy, but because I got an A star in English, I was thinking, maybe I've picked the wrong degree. But quickly I realised at Durham that the languages degree is very literature focused, and you have the opportunity to study literature just as you would study literature as an English literature student, the difference being that you're studying literature in a different language and you're learning about a foreign culture. I loved being able to read different books that I wouldn't have come across otherwise, and to be able to learn about cultures that I really didn't know that much about beforehand. So honestly, I am so happy that I studied French and Spanish and not English literature. I'm sure the English degree at Durham is great. It's very well regarded in the UK if you want to study English literature, but I don't really have any regrets not doing that because I got all the literature stuff that I love as part of my languages degree. And then sort of building on that, you're able to really tailor the course to suit your interests and to suit your needs. Obviously in the first year the modules are quite broad and you study a lot of different things, so naturally there will be some things that you like and some things you don't like. But as you progress throughout the degree into the second year and into the final year, you really get to choose modules that are a bit more specialised and more tailored towards your individual academic interests and your research interests. Once you've got through the first year, you can study exactly what you want. And this isn't just true in terms of the literature and the culture modules that you do. You can also choose different languages to either take on or drop at different stages of your degree. When you apply to Durham, you apply for modern languages and cultures rather than applying to a specific language combination. Because the course title isn't specifically linked to a specific language, this means it's quite easy to drop languages or to take up different languages, because there's a lot of flexibility with the way the course is run. I think you can only take up new languages in the first year, but in terms of dropping languages, you can do 3 languages in the first year, 2 languages in the second year, you can do 1 language in the second year, you can do 1 language in the final year, you can do 2 languages in the final year. So there's a lot of flexibility to pick and choose with different language combinations. And then the final thing that I would like to say that I loved about the course was the year abroad. The year abroad was one of the best years of my life so far, and I think a lot of languages students would agree with that. It was just such a memorable time, and I developed a lot of confidence in myself as a person but also as a professional, because I got to do a year's worth of work experience, which is honestly so valuable for graduates. I recently graduated in July this year, and when I've been applying for jobs, all the potential employers in interviews have been really impressed by the fact that I did a year abroad, because it shows resilience, it shows independence, it shows confidence, it shows that you are interested in different cultures and that you can work with people from different cultural backgrounds. Obviously you can study abroad as part of an Erasmus exchange at a university, but I actually think that if you want to work, it's probably a better option, just because gaining a year's worth of work experience is so valuable and so unique as well. Very few graduates can say that they've spent an entire year working by the time they graduate. Obviously some graduates might have done small internships over the summer that are maybe 3 or 4 months long, but my work placement was 8 months long. 8 months of work experience is not that common to have as a fresh graduate, so I was so happy to do that, and I felt really supported on the year abroad as well. The university was particularly useful when I was applying to be a British Council English language assistant. They gave me a lot of advice on the application, how it worked, and then a lecturer at the university wrote a reference for me, so that went across to the British Council, and then I got accepted onto the programme. The university wasn't particularly helpful in terms of finding accommodation. I had to do all that independently, which was incredibly stressful. I actually moved to the Canary Islands without having anywhere permanent to live, and I managed to find something after about 2 weeks, but that was a little bit stressful. But in terms of actually applying to do the year abroad placement, the university is quite helpful with that. Now let's talk about disadvantages of studying languages at Durham, so potential red flags for applicants or current students. The first thing that I want to say, and this is actually something that a lot of fellow students said, is that at Durham the languages degree doesn't really emphasise communication skills in the target language as much as it probably should. You're doing a languages degree, but you only have 2 hours of language practice per week per language. When I was doing my A-levels in sixth form, I had 5 hours per week, so it was definitely a bit of a downgrade not having as much language practice, and I don't think I improved my language skills as much as I really expected to, particularly in the first 2 years before I went on the year abroad in the third year. At the start of the year abroad, I felt very nervous and I felt sort of inadequate, and I suppose you would always feel this when you move to a new country and you have to interact with native speakers who have a really strange accent, because honestly the Canary Islands accent, which I now love, was so difficult to understand at the start. I felt like in the first 2 years there wasn't really much emphasis on practical language skills, so I didn't really know how to interact when I was opening a bank account, when I was going to the police station to register as a foreign citizen living in Spain. I didn't really know much about applying for accommodation and how to rent and how that kind of stuff worked. So in terms of communicating with native speakers when I was on my year abroad, initially I was really shaky, and I feel like if the language degree at Durham had emphasised actual communication skills in the target language, I would have been a lot more confident in myself. Obviously when you do the year abroad, that's an amazing opportunity to improve your language skills and to learn about different accents in different parts of Spain or Latin America, because you can always go to Latin America as well if you don't want to go to Spain. With the year abroad you learn so much about the intricacies and the nuances of the language that you obviously can't really learn if you're living in the UK. So I completely understand that my language skills didn't develop that much in the first 2 years. You kind of get to a point with your language learning where in order to improve any further, you need to go abroad. So the year abroad was really at the right kind of time for me, and I do appreciate that. I just feel like there could have been a bit more preparation in terms of practical communication skills. One of the other things that I would say about languages degrees, and this is specifically for the literature and the culture modules, is that the marking of essays is incredibly subjective. And to be honest, this is probably the case across the UK with all arts and humanities subjects. I don't think it's just a specific issue for Durham, but it's just something to be aware of. I personally felt like different lecturers wanted different things, and there was no real standardisation with the marking. Some lecturers were incredibly generous, some lecturers were quite stingy, and in my honest experience, the French department at Durham are quite harsh with their marking, and they don't seem to give particularly high marks, whereas the Spanish department were a lot more generous. It could be that I was just slightly better at Spanish, but I don't think there was a massive difference. And sometimes there was a big discrepancy between the different marks that I got. And at Durham, at least, you're not able to appeal the marks. You're not able to ask for a remark. So once you get the mark for an essay, you can't really change that, even if you think it's unfair. As I moved throughout the degree from years 1 to 4, I definitely kind of worked out what lecturers were looking for a little bit more, and the more essays I wrote, the better I became. So there's definitely a positive correlation between writing essays and getting higher marks. The more you do, the better you become. It's just a question of practicing and figuring out what lecturers like and what they don't like, and then working with their feedback moving forward. And then the final thing that I would like to say in terms of potential disadvantages, well, not really a disadvantage for some people, just something to be aware of, is the fact that the languages degree at Durham is very exam centric. So you have to do a lot of exams. In my first year and my second year, I had 8 exams in the space of 2 weeks, which is ridiculous because for university exams there is a lot of content to memorise, and obviously it's difficult content as well. So when you have a lot of stuff to do, it's just a bit overwhelming. I know some people quite like exams because you sort of just revise, get it out of the way, and you don't really overthink anything. But personally for me, I get quite stressed about exams, and I feel like the course could have probably not had as many exams as it did, particularly for the literature and the film modules. Like, honestly, cultural modules should not have exams, in my honest opinion, and I don't really understand why they do. The literature exams that we had were closed book, which means that you're not able to take the books into the exam. You had to actually memorise quotations in the target language in preparation for the exam. Then you would be given 2 hours to write an essay on that. And I just don't think that is a good way to test someone's knowledge of literature. Literature is definitely a bit more creative, and when you're writing a literature essay, you need time to brew over your ideas, and you need time to think about arguments that are interesting and a bit more different and a bit more creative. When you have a 2-hour time limit to produce an essay, you're probably not going to perform to the best of your ability. I definitely know in my case, I always did better at coursework essays where I had a few weeks or even a few months to think through ideas and to research and to meticulously plan everything, and then I could write and I could edit and draft. I feel like that was really great for me, and I loved the kind of independent research that came with the coursework-based assessment. But when I had exams, it was just not great. And one thing that I always find kind of weird is that the lecturers would never sit in an exam and write an essay from memory and then it would get published. That would never happen. These lecturers spend months, even years, researching before they even put pen to paper, and then once they have written it, they draft it countless times, they get it proofread by all different kinds of experts before they can even think about it being published. Yet they're forcing their students to write essays in 2 hours, and they expect you to write good quality essays in that time. To me, it just seems a little bit strange. I know some people don't mind exams too much, so for some people this isn't necessarily a disadvantage. I know people who actually preferred doing literature modules just because they were not really overthinking what they were analysing. But for me personally, too many exams as part of the languages degree at Durham. So everyone, that was it for the very long video on studying modern languages and cultures at Durham University. I just want to say thank you to everyone who's watched this, and I really hope that you found it useful and that you've learnt something about the course. Obviously, for the most updated information, you're always best to check the official handbook and the university website, so I will link that down below in the description. But in terms of sort of talking from the perspective of a student, I hope this video was honest and I hope that you found it useful. Even though it is a really long video, there are still a lot of things that I haven't mentioned. So if you have any other questions about the course or about life at Durham in general, please leave them down below in the comments and I'll get back to you either in the comments, or I might even make a video if there are a lot of frequently asked questions. So once again, thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video useful and helpful, and that you learned something, and until next time I will see you all again in my next video.